The case that I'm discussing today is the Durant decision, and the concepts that I'm focusing on are finance for special education, state funding versus federal funding, the debate over the Headlee Amendment, Section 29, Article 9, the amount of time spent in court on this decision, and ultimately who won and how did the court disperse the award. Let's start with the historical concepts. In 1978, Michigan voters approved the Headlee Amendment, which contained Section 29, that prohibited the state from reducing the state's portion of finances for existing services required by units. Units being municipalities, townships, special districts, and school district governments. And it reads, the state is hereby prohibited from reducing the necessary costs of any existing activity or service required of the units of a local government by the state law. Now, the framers understood this and they worded it especially like that because they anticipated that the state may try to move the local government units to federal government to save money. And this line prevented that. Taxpayers could also appeal the unit's proportions through the appellate court. Now, no one knows why they chose the appellate court for recourse, because the appellate court usually doesn't deal with factual issues that most tax cases involved, but they did, and that is the heart of the case, the appellate court. In 1987, 7 taxpayers, including Donald Durant and Fitzgerald School District, brought forth a lawsuit claiming that the state officials had reduced the portion of educational cost paid by the state to a level below that required by the Headlee Amendment. They went to the appellate court like they were supposed to, but the court refused to hear the case, citing that it was not meant to handle factual issues. They also refused to appoint a fact finder. 5 years later, the case went to the Supreme Court. In 1985, the Supreme Court appointed a fact finder and noted that the Headlee Amendment said that any taxpayer of the state shall have standing to bring suit in the Michigan Court of Appeals to enforce the provisions of the amendment. The Court of Appeals then accepted the responsibility of hearing the case. The state first argued that the Headlee Amendment applied only to specific educational programs, such as special education, and not to elementary and secondary education in general, as the plaintiff school districts were contending. Both the Supreme Court and the Appeals Court actually agreed with the state. But then the state got greedy and they said that special education was not a subject of the Headlee Amendment after all. Well, this was too much for the Supreme Court. They disagreed with the state and said that they had to pay. The Supreme Court also criticized the state for taking too long, 17 years. The verdict was handed down, and the amount was $212 million plus to be divided between the schools. Now, the question was who would be awarded, as many of the students were 17 years old. This happened 17 years ago, and many of the students had graduated. A lot of people moved out of district, and who would pay, as the taxpayers were the very people that the Headlee Agreement was trying to help in situations like this. So this is how the award was dispersed. The school districts that were not directly related to the Durant case were not eligible for a portion of the payment. The $212 million would go to 84 school districts, and they were obligated to use it for technology, training, infrastructure, textbooks, instructional software, buses, security, or to retire debt. Now, the last part is very important because by adding that stipulation, it allowed districts to use the payments to retire existing debt giving the current taxpayers a break on it because it reduced the millages. So what was the argument on the other side? Now we'll discuss the arguments from the other side, any changes that I would support, and conclusions from this case. Um, this it is important. The case is important because the state can't go below a certain funding amount for these units or programs. However, this requirement makes it hard to force the state to pay more because they can always say that they've met their obligations by law, so they don't really have to pay more. And remember, because this case is from 1978, that's where we're building the units of payment from. Things have really changed since then, so I feel that this doesn't really keep up with the times when it comes to financing. The changes that I would make would be that I would support tying the the state portion payment of units to the percentage of funding to the amount of students or to the amount of the population, because as the special education amount population grows or declines, so should the so should the percentage of payments that are allotted for those units. So it makes room for population fluctuation. The things that I've learned from this case was that I did learn a lot about special education and how the funding happens. I did not know that the Headlee amendment contains so much in it. For example, it is if you wonder why we have to vote on millages, that comes from this amendment, which limits the automatic increases to a millage. You can't do that without the citizens of the state or district voting for it. So this is where that concept came from. So that was really interesting. And I thought this case contained a lot of interesting twists and turns. And that's my assessment.